So everyone
Hello. Hello. Welcome to the DC History Center. My name is Laura Brower Haygood, and I am so thrilled to have you here at the Carnegie Library today. So let's take this moment actually to also say hello to the folks who are on YouTube with us. We're streaming this program. Please note that this program will be recorded and it will be available on our DC History Center YouTube channel as well. So don't say anything embarrassing because it will be recorded for posterity. So I recently had the chance to spend some time with Sam Smith, who in his heyday here in Washington was a journalist and writer who published the Capitol Gazette. He was also a tireless advocate for DC statehood. And he pressed this book into my hands, which I'm going to show you. This one. It's titled Captive Capital, Colonial Life in Modern Washington, published in 1974. He even signed it for me. The first paragraph of the first chapter reads, "For nearly 1 3/4 centuries, the city of Washington has served as house servant to the national government, garbed in gaudy livery that veils its menial status. Washington does not participate in the Union, it waits on it. It stages a pageant of democracy without sharing in the democracy that is portrayed." Sam's writings to this day bear witness to the fight for home rule and statehood. And so, of course, it made perfect sense to include his seminal essay, The Case for Statehood, in our special themed issue of Washington History Magazine, which we proudly present to you today. And here it is. Here, Sam is represented side by side with the many activists whose shoulders we stand on today. In recognition of the 50th anniversary of the Home Rule Act of 1973, in these pages, you will hear from Josephine Butler, Julius Hobson, Hilda Mason, Charles Cassell, and many, many more. Reading about their extraordinary legacy 50 years later, I am humbled by their boundless energy, their commitment, the range of causes they adopted, and the many ways in which they brought more equity and fairness to our community, step by incremental step. As another one of my teachers, Dr. MJ Rimsha-Pavlovska, discussed in her contribution to this issue, the 1976 bicentennial became an opportunity for Washington to affirm itself and its democratic rights. This is a timely precedent to reflect on, as Mayor Bowser recently announced DC 250, the district's commission charged with recognizing the semi-quincentennial is to thank the editorial team for this tremendous labor of love. And they are all represented here. And so I'd love to ask them to stand as I cite their name. Sarah Schoenfeld, who was our editor for this issue. Ryan Basic. There you are. Wally and Ann Masters. This issue would not have been possible without the generous support of the DC Office of the Secretary, and I extend sincere thanks to the whole team there, including Secretary Kimberly Bassett, Alma Candelaria, and of course, State Archivist and Public Records Administrator Lopez Matthews, who will be joining me at the podium shortly. This issue also enjoyed the generous support of the Association of Oldest Inhabitants and the Jane F. Levy Fund for Washington History. So let's hear from Sarah Schoenfeld, who graciously served as the editor on this issue. Come on up.
All so much for coming out tonight. I was really honored to be asked to edit this issue. And also I was very grateful to have such a nice team of editorial team to work with. So because this was truly a group effort. And I think that we produced a magazine that will both be an engaging resource both for people that are familiar with the history and for those who are not. I am going to, most of all, I want to thank our contributors, and I want to have you stand up as I read your name. We can hold our applause to the end, but I do want to recognize all of our contributors who are here tonight, starting with Michael Fauntroy, who provided the lead article in the issue, Congressional Interference and the Failures of Home Rule. Next, Tim Comfer wrote a beautiful article on Josephine Butler, DC statehood and the everyday work of emancipation. Colbert King, Pulitzer Prize winning Washington Post columnist for a long time, also helped craft the Home Rule Act and graciously sat for an interview for this issue. As did Arrington Dixon, former council members, served on the first Home Rule Council and talked to actually our editorial board member, Derek Musgrove, about his role in getting out the vote for the local referendum for Home Rule in May of 1974. As Laura mentioned, MJ Rimza-Pawlowska contributed one of our teachable moment pieces on the DC Bicentennial Assembly, which was a group of over 200 delegates from across the city who engaged in local projects in conjunction with the 1976 bicentennial, with the achievement of Home Rule being at the top of their list of goals for 1976. Our second teachable moment piece was written by Ryan Reft. It's about Marion Barry's Free DC movement in 1965. And Benji de la Piedra, finally, one of our contributors, please stand up, wrote a piece on former city desk editor at the Washington Post, Herbert Denton, who was at the Post during the early years of Home Rule. We have 4 milestones in this issue. Our member of our university advisory group, Ashley Preston, who wrote a piece on the 50th anniversary of the Mary McLeod Bethune Memorial in Lincoln Park. Tanya Butler Truesdale wrote a lovely piece about her mother, Sandra Butler Truesdale, who passed in 2023, and many of you may know as a champion of DC history and culture and the arts. Charles Francis wrote Lily Vincennes, longtime gay rights activist, also founder of the Washington Blade. And Mara Chakaski wrote on the centennial of the National Capital Planning Commission. Collections manager Autumn Callaghan contributed a nice piece welcoming Nelson Rimmensnyder's new Columbia archives to the DC History Center. And then we have a couple of reviewers, maybe they're here, Diana Parcell and John Richardson. Thank you very much for your book reviews. And I think that about wraps it up. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I know you don't know who I am, so I will tell you. I'm happy to be here tonight to bring you remarks on behalf of Kimberly A. Bassett, Secretary of State for the District of Columbia. And we're using state to be hopeful that we will get DC statehood. And so I am Lopez Matthews Jr., the State Archivist and Public Records Administrator for Washington, DC, which means I am the Director of the DC Office of Public Records and Archives. So congratulations to Laura Brower Haygood and the entire staff of the DC History Center on the publication of their special themed issue of Washington history on DC statehood and all of the work they do to promote both DC statehood and the study of DC history. The Office of the Secretary of the District of Columbia provides protocol, authentication, ceremonial, and public records management services on behalf of the mayor and district government agencies. This includes managing the District of Columbia Archives, which I run, commissioning District of Columbia Notaries Public, and publishing the DC Register and DC Municipal Regulations. The Office of the Secretary is responsible for maintaining official records of mayoral actions preparing executive orders and proclamations, and acting as a liaison between the government and the diplomatic community. So our office does a lot, but most importantly, for this evening, the office administers the DC Statehood Grant. And so for more than a decade, the district has provided grants to nonprofit organizations to educate the public on the challenges related to the district's lack of full democratic representation. As a longtime partner and grantee, the DC History Center has exemplified what it looks like to bring awareness to the necessity of DC statehood through their public programming and educational efforts. So thank you for being a great partner, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you.
In that case, I think we're now ready for our program. Michael, Martin, take it away.
Well, thank you. Really quick, we'll do the introductions and then get to the heart of the conversation, which is the most important part. I'm Martin Austermuhle. I was a longtime local reporter with WAMU before I took a year-long sojourn to Switzerland for another opportunity, then came back. Fun fact, Switzerland and DC are very similar. The Swiss Constitution was modeled after the American Constitution. The only difference is that their federal capital, Bern, citizens there did get voting rights and have full representation. So Americans could learn something from the Swiss. Anyhow, we are going to jump into the conversation with Professor Michael Fauntroy. He's a professor at George Mason, also has taught at Howard. I'll let him go deeper into his own biography, but needless to say, he is an expert on home rule because he's literally written a book about it. And this is the third book I think I got when I got to DC about 22 years ago. Sam Smith's was, I think, maybe the second, and Dream City by Tom Short and Harry Jaffe may have been my first. Anyhow, this was kind of the prevailing, this is the book on home rule and, you know, how DC got it, what it meant, and the limitations that it's had. And that's what the conversation is going to be about today. So let's just jump into it. And I think, obviously, I know that the majority of the people in this room know everything there is to know about DC history, but there's probably people watching online who don't. So let's start with some basic foundational stuff. Why, when Congress passed the Home Rule Act in 1973, 50 some odd years ago, why did that have to happen? Why was there a situation where the district actually needed home rule, needed a grant of home rule?
Before I answer the question, I just need to say two things real quick. It's a complete ad-lib. First, well, one of them is a complete ad-lib. First is, I want to thank the DC History Center for providing this opportunity and doing this work. It can be difficult and lonely at times, trying to get people educated and understanding what's at stake. And so I just want to salute you all for this work and encourage you to continue to do it. That's really important. The second piece of this, so I'm glad you all are clapping. I haven't even said what I was going to say. The second piece is, Martin mentioned Bern. I just need to say quickly, so earlier in my career, before I went into the academy, I worked as a researcher at the Congressional Research Service, where these analysts provide research and consultations to members and committees of Congress. Well, DC was one of my assignments in addition to housing and voting rights. And one assignment we got was to compare DC as the capital of the United States with other major capital cities around the world on the questions of access, voting, and all of that. And Bern was one of the cities that we studied. So I happen to know that topic, but I just underline it here because there are capitals in communist countries that have more profound, deeper, and real rights than the capital city in the American experiment of democracy. And so I am jealous of Bern as a lifelong resident. Now to your question. So as you know, democracy requires the participation of the people. That's fundamental, right? That's like a basic low-hanging bar to cross. So as it relates to DC, and I look at these pictures around here, if you all haven't had an opportunity to look at the pictures on the other sides of these partitions, please do so, because it sort of tells you a story in microcosm about why home rule was so important. I think it's mentioned in the journal that I am the nephew of Walter Fauntroy, and I'm going to slightly amend that Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you. I'm gonna amend that slightly because, you know, we have a big family. I am a nephew, I'm not the nephew. Cousins who would take issue with that. But you know, as we talk about in the context of this room, this beautiful room, you know, my father graduated from Cardozo High School in 1953. And in September of 1950, he entered the building that's depicted on the other side of this wall for the first time. And I graduated from Wilson High School in 1984, and the class of 1987, and the class of 1987 is depicted on the wall on this side. Now, if you look at the pictures of these classes, you'll see one of the reasons why home rule was so important, and that is it helped break down some of these racial barriers that existed. And we know that there was a court decision that desegregated the schools right before Brown versus Board of Education as it related to the district. But from that decision in the early 1950s to Brown, to the Civil Rights Movement, to the Home Rule Act in 1973, what we're doing, I was a kid at the time, so I can't really say I was doing a lot, but what the residents of the city who cared about democracy were doing was trying to usher this country to represent and reflect all that it purported to mean and be. And so for me, to your question, home rule is really about completing the mission that was created with the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And even now, as we wonder just, as in some respects, sort of are amazed at how permanent and how stubborn and rigid changing and fixing things can actually be. This commemoration tonight and the 50th anniversary reflections on the Home Rule Act, in my view, serve a really important purpose of getting people and reminding people just how important it is and necessary it is to continue to seek to be the best that we can be as a country. I'll just say quickly that, and we'll talk about this toward the end, but I'll preview it now. You know, what we are celebrating today is not permanent, can be reversed. And I think 2025 may represent the biggest threat to home rule that we've seen in at least a generation, if not more. And so as we continue to reflect and think, not just about what we've done to get where we've gotten, acknowledging that we're not where we need to be, we need to continue that at the same time, protecting what we've gained, because it's not unreasonable to think that it could be lost.
So this is a great time to bring up the magazine, the issue, because so much of the stuff, what you just mentioned, the Southern strategy that Walter Fauntroy pursued, Colby King's kind of description of the inner workings of how the debate hashed out to get home rule, it's all in there, it's fascinating. So if you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. But turning to your piece, which is, I think this is a key part about home rule then, home rule now, and the conversation that we're gonna have. You called the passage of the Home Rule Act a, quote, exercise in political compromise. So talk about those compromises, and if you think, you know, I think most people will agree that it was, what came out of it was good for the district. I mean, it was better than what had come before. But what were the feelings that people had on during that debate? What were people upset about? Even though they may have said, look, it's great that we got a mayor, we got an elected council, we have a little bit more autonomy, but what were people upset about?
Right. So I just want to make sure we all understand what I mean by the word compromise. I'm not using it as a pejorative. I'm using it as a reality of the political process. One of the reasons why our current national political dialogue is as screwed up as it is because there's a resistance to this idea of compromise. We got to get everything we want. You can't have anything you want. And that's the way it's supposed to be. When you have 51% of the legislature, you get to make 100% of the decisions. I'm not using the word compromise in that context. What I'm saying is reasonable people from different perspectives come together to try to solve a problem. That will require some people to move on things that they want and require other people to move on things that they want to get to the finish line. So in that regard, I'm thinking about compromise as it relates to the final passage of the bill, the Home Rule Act. Whenever there's a controversial bill that's passed, one of the things you're trying to calculate is how many votes can I lose and still get what I need, right? And so sometimes you look at the final vote and you wonder, could we have held firmer on certain things and still gotten across the finish line? And so that's what I'm referring to with regard to the Home Rule Act. The vote was substantial. You can, on the margins rather, argue that perhaps certain things didn't have to be given away and you could have still passed the bill to get substantially what you wanted. You know, there are compelling arguments on both sides of that. Some of you may know that during the Nixon administration, Senator Ted Kennedy led an effort for what would have become a universal health care program in the United States. And at the last second, the deal fell through, in part because Kennedy didn't want to sort of be flexible and move on certain things that Nixon wanted. Kennedy felt like, well, we can always come back to this next year or the year after and get it done. And decades later, there was still no movement until the Affordable Care Act. So sometimes you can push too hard, thinking you'll get another bite at the apple, and then not. So I understand why certain compromises were made, notwithstanding the fact that I think some people will argue, and were arguing then, that too much was given away.
And the compromises, I mean, they include stuff like, obviously, there's still congressional control over the budget. They still have, you know, every bill that gets passed by the council goes back to Capitol Hill for its review period, things like that.
Appointment of judges, you know, that's a really big deal. There was a real pushback against the idea that the mayor would appoint the judges. Now, sort of optically and stylistically, if I were a prospective judge, I would like to be able to say I was appointed by the president and not the mayor. You know, I get that, but in the context of local decision making, right, this was something that should have been done. These appointments should be made by the mayor, but that was one of the things that was sort of put on the table in order to get the bill across the finish line.
And one key thing is that you explain in your article and also in your book is obviously, and we know this just as DC residents, anybody who knows the basics of DC history, that Congress has a lot of control over the district and has had it over the last 50 years. It had it before Home Rule, it's had it since. But the way it's exercised the power has obviously changed over time. Just in the 50 years of Home Rule, how have you seen, or how do you think that that exercise of power has changed? Has it changed, or is it pretty much the same as it was before?
This is fascinating because for a number of reasons. I teach an undergraduate course on the presidency and had class earlier today. And the first day of class, we spent time talking about the Constitution and what it says about the president. Because in our democracy, everything begins with the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution is the language regarding the seat of the national government, right? And gives Congress all authority and power in all cases whatsoever, which can be generously interpreted to mean statehood or expansion of home rule or anything in between. So one of the other things I tell my students, and you know, my oldest students are 22 and 23, you know, and they're upset about TikTok bans and all these kinds of things. But one of the things I emphasize with them is the importance of the historical context around the issue that you're trying to evaluate. So as we think about home rule and how it has evolved, we have to be careful not to just look at it in the context of 2025 but also think about it in the context of the years and decades that led to the passage of the Home Rule Act in 1973, the election in 1974, the swearing in and seating in 1975. It's important for everybody to remember that in some ways we were creating something out of nothing and trying to figure out how to make it work. Literally fixing the plane as it was in the air, if I could use that metaphor, notwithstanding the tragic events of last night. It is really interesting to see how these changes sort of reflect the changing energy in the city. In 1973, we're sort of in that post-civil rights era period. There's a lot of energy around Black empowerment, and some of that helped explain why certain compromises had to be made, because there were concerns in Congress about what a majority Black city would lead, would reflect, and would result in a lot of concern about that in the city. So in terms of some of the changes, one of the big changes for me was in that period during the 1980s and into the early 1990s, when you look at some of the activity in Congress, what you saw was a lot of, in my opinion, overreaction to Marion Barry and his presence. And an attempt, this was the very early stages of America's culture wars and culture politics, where we use certain cultural issues as a proxy for division around race, and this idea that democracy and the protection of democracy could be used as a proxy for other kinds of concerns. So as I reflect on changes in home rule over the years, a lot of those changes reflect and sort of are a trailing indicator of some of the districts in America's racial hangups. As there was a much stronger and deeper ascendancy of Black politics in the city, Congress reacted to that. And as that has waned, particularly in the post-control board era, we see less of that. Now that doesn't mean it can't come back again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. It can always come back, but as it stands now, we're at a relatively calm period, admittedly acknowledging that the new administration at the White House probably has its eyes on the city and look to do things that it would not otherwise be able to do.
One thing I think is fascinating about both your book and the piece in the magazine is you kind of went through, especially in your book, you detailed over the years all the different ways that mostly Republicans, but some Democrats would get involved and would interfere in district's local affairs, whether it's through the budget or through actual legislation targeting just the district. And it was everything from telling the district exactly how many firefighters it had to have on duty to what sort of trash they can and cannot pick up. There was issues related to the city's old taxi zone system, which we all loved or hated, depending on your point of view. To much more significant issues, obviously, how the district can or cannot use money for abortions. There's needle exchange programs. There's medical marijuana. I mean, many of us know the examples. So I think it was fascinating is how you kind of detail those. Did you ever see? What did you think of those maybe less significant issues, like interferences? Like, did you ever get a sense of why members of Congress would care about how many firefighters are on duty on any given day?
So this is a fascinating subplot. You want to know what the priorities of a government may be? Look at how it conducts itself in a budget. Right? And congressional rules prohibit legislating and appropriation bills. So as you know, there are committees that authorize legislation, and then the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee allocates the funds to implement whatever the legislation calls for. Now, this is an important distinction because the thought was it would prevent Congress from using money to compel parts of the government from doing things that the president may not want them to do. The only time that's been violated, and has been violated a zillion different times, is as it pertains to the district. The House District Committee would pass legislation. House Appropriations Committee would prohibit the spending of dollars on that particular item. Now, you mentioned who's doing that, right? It was often Republicans, but it was notably also Democrats. So across the street is a parking lot right now. Some of you may have parked in it. Some of you have seen it a zillion times. On that ground was the original DC Convention Center. And that convention center was an underutilized engine of entertainment, sports, and other economic development in the downtown area of the city. So why was that? One of the reasons was that we're going to use names, we're going to name names. Is that what we're doing today?
Whatever you feel comfortable with, but yeah.
Let's name names. So how many of you all have heard the name Steny Hoyer? I know everybody has. Representative Hoyer was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1980, and it is still a member of Congress. And now I'm not making an assessment on longevity or service, but he's seen and done a lot. And for the early years of his service in Congress, he represented the district that was a district in Maryland that was adjacent to the District of Columbia. Cross Southern Avenue, you cross Eastern Avenue, you're in his district. Also in his district was a newly created building called the Capitol Center, which is where the Washington Bullets played, the Washington Capitals, the circus came to town there. Everything you can imagine was held in the Capitol Center, including Georgetown University basketball, which in the early 1980s, early mid-80s was a really big deal. The Georgetown Hoyas hosted their home games at the Capitol Center. Right? So imagine what a building closer to Georgetown's campus could mean for Georgetown basketball and for the city as Georgetown basketball is ascending in national prominence. So why were the games never held at the convention center, which was big enough to provide a spectacular atmosphere? Well, one of the reasons was Congress put legislation in the appropriations bill prohibiting the district from hanging a scoreboard from the ceiling and hosting certain kinds of athletic competitions. So why would Congress be involved in how the district would use its own convention center paid for with local funds? That's because Abe Pollin, the owner of the Capitol Center and the owner of the Bullets and the Caps, worked with Representative Hoyer and Maryland senators, all of whom most of whom during that period were Democrats, to prevent the District of Columbia from hosting these kinds of events in the convention center. So that's one example of the ways in which the district was prohibited by Congress from using its own resources to engage in economic development for itself. My favorite example, though, concerns the swimming pool at my alma mater, then known as Woodrow Wilson Senior High School, now known as Jackson Reed. The Congress, which is responsible for a multi-trillion-dollar budget and millions of employees and services all over the place, for some reason found it necessary to put legislation in an appropriations bill to prohibit the pool at Woodrow Wilson Senior High School from being used after 8 p.m. Now, why would that be the case? Turns out there were staffers who lived near the pool and were bothered by the noise. Again, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 allows Congress to do it, but just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean you necessarily should do something, particularly on something as fundamental as home rule and democracy and all this kind of stuff. So these are among the numerous ways in which Congress has engaged itself on very mundane and unnecessary things. We are at a quiet period, but throughout the 70s and especially during the 80s, we saw way too much of that. And there's so many examples. You mentioned needle exchange and same-sex marriage and just all of this stuff, you know, I'm using the nomenclature of that time. It's frustrating to sort of relive some of that, but it's also necessary because we all need to be reminded of it.
And obviously, like you said, we're at a low point, but these things still happen. Just last year when I was looking through a draft spending bill for the district that the Republicans had drafted, they included one provision in there regarding asking the district to produce a report about how many times they were fining people for putting garbage outside of private property in public space. Now, for Congress to ask the district to produce a report about how they're handling sanitation, clearly, again, one of these situations, like this is not of national concern.
Yeah,
so I tried to figure out which staff or which office, who was annoyed by this, who reached out to who, was never able to get an answer because probably no one wants to fess up to that one, be like, that was me, I'm the one who asked about refuse, but either way.
And may I just say quickly, you all should know that Congress often tries to use the Congressional Research Service to research these kinds of issues and provide cover for members of Congress. Because the Congressional Research Service, if you all don't know, is the single most spectacular repository of political research, contemporary political research, historical political research that we have. And the way it works is a staffer or a member of Congress has a question or wants a report or a memo on something, and we'll pick up the phone or email a staffer who covers that area in CRS. And often what ends up happening is the CRS staffer, particularly if they're experienced and savvy, will try to reshape some of these really crazy requests into things that are more doable. And if they can't do that or can't give them the answer they want, then it may end up in a bill somewhere. And at that point, you know, anything can happen.
So I want to come back to one thing that you touched upon, I think 2 answers ago, but I want to delve in just a little bit more. In your article, in your book, you write that racial conservatism has long been kind of one of these like motivating factors for Congress's relations with the district. And again, this was when the district was majority Black. It was, it was Chocolate City. It was kind of that relationship. Obviously, the city has changed a lot since. Do you think that has changed, that degree of racial conservatism? Do you think it's gone away? Do you think it's coming back? Like, how is that playing out?
So let me just 30,000 foot this first. Racism is omnipresent in all ways, in almost all places. It ebbs and flows. There are different ways in which it's weaponized. In the early 1980s, some of you may recall the avatar of the welfare queen, right? Which was used to sort of create a narrative around Black women and poverty and corruption. And that has been, that ebbs and flows and evolves over time. It was, also in the 80s, it was just affirmative action. And now, of course, it is DEI. And DEI causes everything. It's responsible for everything that goes wrong in America right now. So we don't need much to light the fuse on this. And one of my concerns is that we're about to enter a whole new phase of this. And I wonder to what extent we are prepared to respond, speak intelligently and forcefully in response. Our communication streams are so different now than they were 40 years ago. our public discourse is much more diffuse now than it's ever been. We run the risk of sort of preaching to the choir and the people who need to hear you are on different platforms. So I'm worried that we're about to see a whole new sort of generation of this.
It's really interesting that you mentioned, obviously, the DEI is kind of the new everything.
Right, it's the new N-word.
Right, exactly.
If we can be fair.
And what I find ironic about it too, with relation to the district to home rule, is that one provision of the Home Rule Act that still lives on to this day and how the city council works, I think of as a very DEI provision. It's the fact that 2 of the seats have to be set aside for non-Democrats, because the idea was they were concerned, Republicans were concerned that they were never going to get a seat in Democratic DC, so they set aside 2 seats for themselves, which if you talked about it today in any other context, someone would say, hold on, you're setting aside positions for people who aren't qualified or may not be good for that. That's DEI, in effect. So
well,
that's
their connotation of DEI.
Right.
Right, sure. Well, so Martin, I don't know how safe you're going to be going home tonight if you're going to be telling the truth like this. So that's fascinating. Wouldn't it be something if someone introduced legislation tomorrow to reverse that, isn't that? And call it the anti-DEI political legislative act of 2025?
it was his idea, guys, his idea.
But yes, it's and we see that, and by the way, we see that around the country in the form of legislative redistricting. There are districts in almost every state in the country that are cut for very similar reasons. And so, yeah, let's start some trouble on that. Let's fight that up and start some trouble.
All right, I have one more question before. I think there's some questions that were circulated, some note cards potentially. So if those exist, I would love to grab those. But you've already kind of started touching upon this, but I feel like the audience really wants to know, people really want to know. Obviously, you're a historian. You do a great job telling us things that happened in the past, analyzing them, interpreting them, explaining them well. But we want to turn towards the future a little bit. We want to get a sense of, given what you know about what has happened in the district with its relationships with Congress, the interference that has happened, do you have predictions for the future? Do you have a sense of what's coming? I mean, obviously you've already said you don't feel optimistic about it.
So I've been thinking about this lately, and I'm thinking about it in terms of commerce and real estate, right? So we know that there's a deal in the works regarding the RFK site. But remember too, that the FBI headquarters is supposed to be moving. And done properly, I mean, it might be a bit of a stretch, but not too much of a stretch, just saying over the course of years, that's $1 billion development opportunity. Right? So what's to stop the current administration from directing the redevelopment of that space to their preferences, even if those preferences run counter to the interests of the district? Okay. So when I think about the future, I'm thinking about it primarily in commercial terms. What happens with the prime real estate that is in this city? Who gets it? How is it decided who gets it? And what happens with it? I'm concerned about the height limitations. I love the fact, I know a lot of you don't, right? I get it, I know there's an argument, but I love the fact that our skyline is as it is, right?
From the audience on that one. I'm the one who does.
I don't know, not everybody clapped. I think the people that didn't clap but I love the way our city looks in that regard. You go to other large cities and it's a completely different ballgame. I am very fond of Paris. I love the fact that Paris, for the most part, except for the outer edges, looks this way. I want that protected. But the President of the United States is a real estate developer. What if members of Congress say, we want to do away with these height limitations and build a 40-story museum to President Trump. Now, I know that seems illogical, right? Now, I will also say I thought it was illogical that the election results would turn out as they did. So I'm just saying, everything's on the table. Everything's on the table. I think a serious attempt to repeal home rule is on the table. Although I think in the end that will fail because the reality is you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar municipal government, and all municipal governments of that size are difficult to run. Right? So, you know, they'll talk about it, but I don't think they'll do it. That doesn't mean they won't try, but, you know. So I just think that as we think about the future, we need to disabuse ourselves of any notion that certain things can't happen. I now believe anything can happen, and it cuts both ways. Some good things can happen. So there's a roadmap to statehood, but I also think there's a roadmap to pre-1973.
Do you think the mayor's, to this point, I mean, it's early on in the administration, but she's approaching kind of transactionally. She recognizes that there's certain things that occupy the president's mind, development, like the federal government, getting office people, federal workers back into offices, and the mayor is focused on that. Do you think this kind of quasi-transactional approach and trying to tone down the statehood talk and the kind of like rah, we should be left to our own devices is a good approach with President Trump?
I don't know that there's a better option. So I'm at George Mason University right now, but from 2013 to 2021, I was on the faculty at Howard University and had the great honor of having former Congressman Ron Dellums come to my class every semester and speak to the students. Dellums chaired the House District Committee for years. And he said something to one of my classes that just always stuck with me and helped explain a kind of what I would call progressive pragmatism. And that is, you know, legislating is about making the best decision from the available options. Politics is about making the best decision from the available options. Right now, I'm not sure that Mayor Bowser has a better option than the transactional approach that you just described. And that's disappointing at some level because, you know, I believe we should take it to the streets, so to speak. But I also think in our current political climate, that kind of protest can be used to weaponize other things.
So we can look forward to the President Trump Memorial Stadium at RFK at some point. We can laugh about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened.
So what you just said is both insane and possible. Right? Think about it. Think about the serious Trump supporters on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol, who might put a rider in this legislative language and say, we'll only support it if you name it after Donald J. Trump. Who among us really thinks that can't happen? Right? So, yes, anything is possible.
All right, I got some great questions coming in from the audience. One, and this I'm sure has been, you know, everybody who's been in DC for more than a year has probably struggled with this one, but I want to ask you what you think. How do you think DC residents can engage non-DC residents to, number one, know about the district situation and care about it?
I think the first part is easier than the second part. So, because of what I do professionally, I've come to learn a lot about democracy, people, politics, and all of that. And one of the things that I'm fighting right now is a kind of cynicism about who we are as a society. I think there are a lot of people that don't really care what goes on with their other fellow citizens. They just want what they want and are perfectly comfortable with the circumstance that we face. For those people, and it may be a near majority, I don't know what the number is, but for those people, I'm not sure there's anything that can be done. But I'm also optimistic in that education and the kind of work that's done in this center can help change enough minds that things can happen. So how do you do that? My wife and I have 17-year-old twins. They're seniors in high school. And for those of you who have recently had 17-year-old twins or 17-year-old children, you know there's a particular energy in your house, right? And one of the things I've learned with our kids and also my students is the infinite power of social media. It is infinitely powerful for good and for ill. There are people you've never heard of who've carved out profound brands for themselves around particular issues, just sharing information about things. People I've never heard of that have 1, 2, 3 million followers. So I think social media is part of the answer. A concerted effort among regular people to share information in a particularly well-polished way about where we are could help educate the public more generally and potentially turn around some people who don't think much about it.
Just not on TikTok, or maybe on TikTok for a little bit, but who knows?
Hey man, wherever the answers are, wherever you gotta go.
So this is another interesting question, probably as controversial as the question as anything related to the Hyde Act. But when the Home Rule Act was being debated, or at any point in history, was there ever serious consideration about retrocession to Maryland? Just returning the district, the portion that we are in the portion of the district that
Right.
was once Maryland, returning it to Maryland.
Yeah, there've been proposals to that end. So this, talking about some of this stuff is sometimes odd for me because you can't really have a conversation about home rule in the district, particularly how we got it, without talking about my uncle. And I can remember being a little fellow, a young dude, hearing conversations about this. I mean, part of the reason why I'm such a geek about politics is listening to my parents talk about it, listening to my uncle and other family members talk about it. I literally grew up in this. I was that sort of strange kid who rushed home from school, not just to watch cartoons, but also to watch the Watergate hearings, right? I was that kid, and paying attention to the news. And one of the things I learned from him was the role of John McMillan, who was a member of the House of Representatives, who for years bottled up home rule legislation. He represented a district in South Carolina that is now represented by Jim Clyburn, which is an interesting sort of juxtaposition because McMillan was a staunch racist, segregationist, and repeatedly, like other Southern members of Congress who ran the district committee, sort of used district government as a jobs program for their constituents who couldn't find work. So they would bring their constituents to DC and give them jobs in the district government because they controlled the district government. So McMillan, in an attempt to derail home rule legislation, offered up some alternative legislation. And part of that alternative legislation was the retrocession of DC to Maryland. And throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, an Ohio congressman by the name of Ralph Regula, at the beginning of every Congress, introduced legislation to retrocede the current district to Maryland. Now, this was really interesting to me in part because Maryland didn't want DC at the time and DC didn't want Maryland. And so it never went anywhere, but it spoke to the sort of win at all costs mentality that some members of Congress had when it came to not granting this place that was seen at the time as, you know, too liberal, too black, too urban, too democratic, additional political power.
All right, unfortunately, I think we have time for one more question. And I think this kind of gets us back to the beginning. You mentioned when you worked at the Congressional Research Service and you looked at kind of the setup of other capital cities across the world. Did you find any were there any examples of cities that are set up like DC that have a similar situation where it's a federal city and the people within the city have no actual local representation?
So the closest, if I can remember this correctly, was Canberra, Australia. But even, I mean, everybody has a better setup than we do. So during this, we studied 10 cities, 10 capital cities around the world, and some are more difficult to get information on than others. A colleague of mine, I was sort of the junior researcher at the time, and we were just stunned at how the world's sort of model democracy, so to speak, had this incredible hole in its soul around the representation of people in its capital city. So my uncle was among those who sort of coined the slogan, "Mend the crack in the Liberty Bell." All right, so you go to Philly, you see the Liberty Bell, you see this gigantic crack in it. And that crack in this metaphor is the lack of full representation and statehood for the District of Columbia. And so, you know, it is, I mean, North Korea, Cuba, Baghdad, I mean, just pick a place. You know?
I mean, it's American exceptionalism in both great and terrible ways. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have. This is a fascinating discussion, so I want to thank Professor Fauntroy, obviously, for his expertise on this issue. See the folks here at the History Center, which has done a fantastic job with this place. I mean, this is beautiful, and for putting together a great magazine and for hosting the event. So thank you for that.
Thank you for an incredible conversation. It's been such a challenging week, and I didn't expect after this conversation tonight to actually feel a little better. And maybe that comes from being together as friends and neighbors, and thinking, yeah, anything is possible. You know. All right, so thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I have a few more acknowledgements and just some housekeeping items for you. First of all, I want to thank the editorial board, who plays a really important role in Washington history. If there are a few members of the editorial board here today, please wave. No? Okay, well, maybe they're online. Hello. So Washington history is a benefit of membership. So this is a perfect chance to say thank you to the folks in the room who are members. Let me try that again. Show of hands. Much better. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. If you do not already have your issue of Washington history, which again, I'll share with you here, don't leave the Carnegie Library without it. If you have two options, you can buy a single copy for $25, or if you join as a member at the $120 level or above, you will receive a free copy of the special issue in addition to the 2 semi-annual issues that you would receive as part of your membership. So very nice deal. And you can do either one of those in the little shop area at the very back of the gallery. If you leave without, however, and you come to regret it, you can buy the issue on our website at dchistory.org, but the member deal is only for today. I extend a special thanks to Events DC and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities who support all of our public programming. And I'm also grateful to my wonderful team for organizing tonight's event. Marilyn, can you give a little wave? Marilyn? And, before my last little housekeeping items, I just want to do one last round of applause for our incredible speakers who really a great deal thanks to this conversation tonight, and there's so much more in the issue itself. Michael, by the way, where can we get your book?
I'm not sure. It's, so I wrote this book it was published in 2003. And I'm sure it's available online.
For $120.
Well, I can assure you, I'm not getting any of that.
I'm accepting bids, people. I'm accepting bids.
And so the book is at the Kiplinger Research Library, but unfortunately you can't check it out.
Well, and as I understand it, it's in some of the branches of the public library. And so, it's around, and, I may have a few copies at home.
All right. Well, if you decide to, reissue it, let us know.
I will.
Okay, we want to be the first to know. All right, we now encourage you to proceed into Memorial Hall, where we have some light drinks and snacks for all of you. We will be shutting down this room, so please don't leave your personal belongings here and take them with you. The snacks are in the North Gallery this evening, with your left as you exit this gallery. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to have you with us tonight. And please enjoy the celebration of Washington History Magazine.